Welcome to this session on philosophy of Immanuel Kant. In this session, we are dealing with Kant's epistemology and his famous text Critique of Pure Reason. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher and a key figure in modern philosophy. His major works include the Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason and the Critique of Judgment. Apart from philosophical topics such as epistemology, ethics and aesthetics, his writings cover psychology, politics, natural science and mathematics. All his major works are detailed and elaborate, contains divisions and subdivisions, proves different types of expositions, deductions, method of disproof by contradiction, etc. The elaborate nature of arguments and the very method of arguing make his work obscure and difficult. His language is also considered to be unfriendly to studies and translation. This session deals with Kant's ideas on epistemology, ethics and aesthetics. This session covers the initial portion of his epistemology till the analytic of concepts. Kantian epistemology. Epistemology is a word of Greek origin and could roughly be translated to English as theory of knowledge. The nature, source, validity, limits and scope of knowledge are the pivotal topics in epistemology. The history of Western epistemology goes back to ancient Greece and continues till date. In the 18th century, European epistemology was dominated by British empiricism, championed by John Locke, George Berkeley and David Hume. Their empiricism developed as an antithesis to continental rationalism championed by Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz. Rationalism is a school of thought which maintains that reason is the ultimate source of knowledge. Descartes was of the view that human mind had innate ideas. Innate idea is an idea inborn in the human mind, considered to be placed by God. Rationalists maintain that all valid knowledge could be deduced from such innate ideas with the help of reason, just as in mathematics or geometry. In opposition, empiricism maintains that the mind is a blank at birth. There are no innate ideas. We derive all our knowledge from experience only. Kant, in developing his epistemology, borrowed from both these schools. He stated that both empiricism and rationalism are right in what they affirm, but wrong in what they deny. Empiricism is right in as much as they opine that the raw material of knowledge is received through the senses, but it is wrong in denying a priori faculties of the mind which are required for generation of knowledge. Rationalism is right in saying that there are a priori factors of knowledge, but it is wrong in saying that all knowledge is already present in the mind. Kant was of the opinion that knowledge begins with experience, but does not necessarily originate from it. Both sense, that is external sense data, and understanding, that is a priori functions of the mind, are required for generation of knowledge. Kant's epistemology can be summed up in his statement, knowledge begins with experience, proceeds to understanding and ends in reason. David Hume was an empiricist. He believed that all knowledge comes from sense experience, but he took this idea to logically dangerous levels and argued that what we had was just sense data and nothing more. For example, take an apple. Our eyes can see red color and round shape. Our hand can feel a smooth tactile sensation. Our nose can feel the smell and our tongue can feel the taste. We just have these sensations. Apart from them, we have absolutely no sensation of apple as such. There is no proof to show that the object or apple exists. Likewise, when we look into ourselves, we can see only passing ideas or sensations and can never catch what is called the self. Hume also rejected the idea of causality. He stated that one could only see one billiard ball striking the other and the other moving, but the senses gave no idea of causality in this transaction. Hence, by his extreme empiricism, Hume doubted the existence of the outer world, the inner self and causality. Hence, Hume is called a skeptic, that is, a person who doubts accepted opinion or knowledge. Hume's ideas, if taken to the extreme, could reach solipsism. In general, solipsism is the argument that nothing, including the world or other minds, exists outside one's own mind. Hume's skepticism questioned the very fundamentals of epistemology and science. The concepts such as the object of knowledge, the knowing subject and law of causality, etc., had to be explained afresh. Hence, after reading Hume, Kant had to wake up from his old ideas to find answers to the doubts of Hume. That is why Kant said that Hume woke up him from his dogmatic slumber. Kant found that Hume's skepticism originates from believing that sensations alone constitute knowledge. Kant argued that certainty of knowledge exists not in sensations, but in a priori concepts of the mind. The critique of pure reason is an attempt to explain, establish and prove such a priori faculties of the mind. It also aims to show the limitation of mental faculties. Distinction between synthetic and analytic propositions and between a priori and a posteriori judgments are ideas with which one has to familiarize prior to studying Kant's epistemology. Take the proposition Ram is tall. In this proposition, Ram is the subject and tall is the predicate. A proposition in which the predicate is already contained in the subject is called an analytical proposition. Example, a hot cake is hot. This proposition does not give any new information about the subject. But the earlier statement, Ram is tall, is not so. Tall is not an idea already contained in Ram. Such propositions in which the predicate is not already contained in the subject are called synthetic propositions. They give new information about the subject. Analytic proposition is valid by logic, but synthetic proposition requires experience to validate them. Now, let us come to a priori and a posteriori judgments. An a priori judgment is one which is valid prior to experience. Example, all triangles have 3 angles. Even if no one has ever seen or known a triangle is a 3-angle figure. But an a posteriori judgment comes only from senses. Example, it is raining outside. An a posteriori judgment is dependent on the sense organs for validity, whereas a priori judgments are not. Valid or scientific judgments. Here we are going to learn about synthetic and analytic statements. We have also learned about a priori and a posteriori judgments. But what is the nature of valid or scientific judgments? Scientific principles should add to our knowledge. Hence, they must be synthetic, but they should be certain and beyond doubt. Hence, they must be a priori. For Kant, all theoretical sciences of reason contain synthetic a priori judgments as principles. He says that the judgments of mathematics and natural sciences are synthetic but a priori. Take for example, 7 plus 5 is equal to 12. Kant says that the idea of 12 is not contained either in 7, 5 or plus. Hence, 7 plus 5 is equal to 12 is synthetic, but they are true prior to experience, that is a priori. The geometric truth, the straight line between 2 points is the shortest, is also synthetic, but a priori in the same way. From natural science, statements such as when bodies make other bodies move, action and reaction must always be equal, etc., are shown by him as examples of synthetic but a priori judgments. Just as we mentioned, predicate is not contained in the subject, hence they are synthetic. but they are true prior to experience, hence they are a priori. For Kant, this also means that metaphysics is not possible as a science. Kant was of the view that the knowledge of entities such as God, soul and cosmos do not come from sense experience. Hence, metaphysics cannot be grounded on scientific knowledge. This is discussed in the transcendental dialectic. Now we can discuss refutation of idealism. Kant refutes idealism, that is, he holds that the external world is real. According to him, there are two types of idealism, that is, problematic idealism, which holds that existence of objects in space outside us is doubtful, and dogmatic idealism, which holds space and the objects that it holds itself are doubtful. He believed that dogmatic idealism is insignificant since his transcendental aesthetic has addressed the problem of space and concluded that space is a mental phenomenon. But problematic idealism does not say that space and its objects are unreal, but it just says that through our immediate experience we can't prove anything but ourselves, like in Descartes' cogito ergo sum. Kant says that this sort of idealism can be refuted by showing that we have experience of things outside us and that the outside world is not just an imagination. Kant believed that our inner experience itself is possible only on the assumption of outer experience. However, Kant's epistemology itself is subject based and therefore he is also regarded as an idealist. Now we can discuss transcendental philosophy of Kant. Why Kant calls his epistemological ideas transcendental? Because they are not concerned about what is immanent, that is sense experience, but focus on what transcends or goes beyond experience. In his transcendental philosophy, Kant studies or explains the a priori laws of thought and the innate structure of the mind. I call knowledge transcendental, which is occupied not so much with objects as with our a priori concepts of objects. Kant wrote it, Critique of Pure Reason. His theory is on the subjective a priori functions of knowing, understanding and reasoning. Therefore, Kant is classified as an idealist and his philosophy is called transcendental idealism. Kant's epistemology is elaborated in his most famous work, The Critique of Pure Reason, first published in 1781. The book is voluminous and elaborate. Bertrand Russell says that the whole book is an attempt to explain how synthetic a priori judgments are possible. The book explains in detail how we receive sensations from the external world, how we understand it and how judgments of reason arise from them. The book also details the limitations of understanding. Critique here means critical analysis and not criticism. Pure reason is reason untouched by experience. Now we can see the tree of the contents of this book. Critique of Pure Reason can be mainly divided into two. 1. Transcendental doctrine of elements. 2. Transcendental doctrine of method. Transcendental doctrine of elements can again divided into two: transcendental aesthetic, transcendental logic. Transcendental doctrine of method can be divided into 4: discipline, canon, architectonic, history of pure reason. Transcendental logic can again divided into 2: transcendental analytic, transcendental dialectic. Transcendental analytic can be divided into 3: analytic of concepts, analytic of principles, distinction between phenomenon and noumenon. Transcendental dialectic can be divided into 3: paralogisms, antinomies, ideals of pure reason. Kant believed in the objective existence of the outside world and believed that this objective existence is the precondition for knowledge. Knowledge arises when the mind works on the experience with its a priori faculty. Thus, all knowledge begins with experience, but knowledge does not arise from experience. What is received by the senses, that is percepts, are blind, and the a priori faculties of the mind, that is the concepts, are empty. Concepts without percepts are empty, percepts without concepts are blind. Kant calls the undetermined object of an empirical intuition as appearance. The effect of an object on the capacity of the mind for representation is called sensation. As stated, what is given to the mind is only an appearance. Two stages are involved in converting this raw appearance into understanding as studied in transcendental doctrine of elements. The first stage is the ordering of the raw sensations by applying the form of perception, that is space and time. This part is studied in the transcendental aesthetic. Second stage studies the coordination of such perceptions by applying the categories of the mind and judgments of reason. This is studied in transcendental analytic. The doctrine of elements also examines the limits of human knowledge. Now, we can examine what is transcendental aesthetic. By aesthetic, Kant means the science of the rules of sensibility in general. By transcendental aesthetic, Kant means the science of all rules of a priori sensibility. In transcendental aesthetic, Kant first explains the concept of space and time. The explanation of the concept, that is laying bare his idea of time and space, he called metaphysical exposition of space and time. In metaphysical exposition, he explains his concept of space and time and tries to prove why they are not objective but must be subjective. Secondly, he tries to show how their a priori nature is useful to enrich our understanding. This is called transcendental exposition. His arguments for transcendental and metaphysical exposition of space and time are lengthy and are as follows. A metaphysical exposition, according to Kant, lays bare or makes open the content of the concept. For him, space and time are not objective or outside the mind. They are not actual entities or a relation among things or within things. It is a subjective constitution of the mind and is a priori. It is a form of intuition, that is the form in which pure sensations untouched by thought are received. Kant's arguments in metaphysical exposition of space are as follows. The first one is, the mind must be already representing space as the ground of the other representations, that is as the framework or background or setting within which spatial relations can exist. That is why we relate some of our sensations to something outside us and as outside one another. Hence, it must be a priori. The second one, we cannot imagine the absence of space, though we can imagine that the space is empty. Hence, it is a priori representation. The third one, representation of space is not a general concept, but a pure intuition. We can only represent a single space. Any talk of many spaces is always understood to refer to parts of the one unique space. The fourth, space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. However, we never experience such infinite space. So, such infinite representation of space is not derived from experience, but is a priori. Now, we can deal metaphysical exposition of time. Metaphysical exposition of time is just like the exposition of space. The first one, time is not an empirical concept that has been drawn from experience. We experience events as simultaneous or as one after another because we had an underlying a priori representation of time. The second one, time is a necessary representation that underlies all intuitions. Though we can imagine that nothing happens in time, it will be impossible to imagine things without time. Hence, it is a priori. Third one, it is a priori character of time that makes it possible to have absolute necessary principles or temporal relations or relations of time. The fourth one, representation of time is not a general concept, but a pure intuition. We can only represent a single time. The rules of time are available prior to experience and not through experience. The fifth one, our representation of time is an infinite entity. However, we never experience such infinite time. So, such infinite representation of time is not derived from experience, but is a priori. By transcendental exposition, Kant means explaining a concept as a principle from which the possibility of other synthetic and a priori knowledge can be understood. Here, Kant explains space and time as principles from which the possibility of geometry etc. can be understood. Now, we will discuss transcendental exposition of space. Transcendental exposition explains the concept's role in the acquisition of a priori knowledge. Geometry is a science that discovers the properties of space, doing this a priori, although its results are synthetic. How the propositions of geometry are synthetic a priori has been explained earlier. Geometry goes beyond what is given by the senses. Hence, a priori concept of space has a role in generating the knowledge of geometry. Now, we will discuss transcendental exposition of time. Here, Kant says that the third point in metaphysical exposition is actually transcendental exposition. Secondly, he says that if the representation of the time were not an a priori or inner intuition, then no concept could make comprehensible the possibility of anything altering. In an alteration, two places apply to the same object, and this is possible only because time is a priori. Let us sum up the transcendental aesthetic. Space and time are subjective. All ordered experience involves and presupposes space and time. They are necessary to order, arrange and convert sensations to perceptions. No experience is possible without them, and their absence cannot be thought of. They are the subjective preconditions of any experience. It is this a priori character which makes mathematics possible and space and time infinite. Without space and time, sensations could never grow into perceptions. However, both space and time are empirically real and transcendentally ideal. What Kant means by this statement is that they are real, that is objectively valid with regard to all possible external experience, but at the same time they are non-existent except as the conditions of experience. They are not something that applies to things in themselves without reference to constitution of our sensibility. Kant calls space and time the pure forms of intuition. What he means is that intuitions or external sensations without mixture of a priori content are received by the mind only through the forms of space and time. Now, let us see what is transcendental logic. Transcendental aesthetic describes the point till external sensations are arranged in space and time, but what is arranged in space and time are just sensations. They have to be understood by the mind. Transcendental logic is that part of critique which explains the process of understanding, its roles in generation of knowledge and its limitations. By logic, Kant means the science of the rules of understanding in general. Pure logic is formal, thus it draws nothing from experience. By transcendental logic, Kant means the science of pure understanding, which is a priori and formal. Pure understanding has nothing to do with external objects. It is the subjective faculty which puts together the external sensations and convert them to understanding. Transcendental logic is divided into two: transcendental analytic and transcendental dialectic. In transcendental analytic, Kant describes in detail the transcendental or a priori factors that are involved in understanding how they are applied in judgments and how they apply to the external world. In transcendental dialectic, Kant tries to show the limits of knowledge by exposing the contradictions reached when mind attempts to go beyond what is given by senses. Now, we will see what is transcendental analytic. Kant says that transcendental analytic is the dissection of the whole of our a priori knowledge. The first part of knowledge lies in understanding and second part is judgment or reasoning. The first part of the transcendental analytic is the analytic of concepts. What Kant means by the analytic of concepts is analysis of a priori faculty of understanding. Here, Kant discovers 12 a priori categories of understanding and gives their metaphysical as well as transcendental deduction. The second part is analytic of principles. It is about the rules of application of the understanding of two judgments. Thirdly, the analytic also explains the distinction between phenomena and noumena. Now, we will see analytic of concepts. Kant says this is the dissection of the faculty of understanding. The aim of this dissection is to investigate the possibility of a priori concepts in understanding. Further, it also aims to analyze the pure use of this faculty. What are the a priori conditions that make understanding possible and that remain as its substructure even when everything empirical has been filtered out from appearances? Such a concept that universally and adequately expresses the formal and objective condition of experience Kant calls pure concept of understanding. The analytic of concepts is the analysis of such a priori pure concepts of understanding. By analyzing the logical structure of judgments in Aristotelian logic, that is formal logic, Kant concludes that all logical judgments can be classified into 4 basic types, each of which has 3 subdivisions. Kant writes, if we set aside all the content of judgments and attend only to their form, we find that there are 12 kinds of judgment, specifically 4 groups of 3. Now, you can see Kant's table of judgments. Quantity of judgments, divisions: universal, particular, singular. Quality of judgments, divisions: affirmative, negative, infinite. Relations of judgments, divisions: categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive. Modality of judgments, divisions: problematic, assertoric, apodictic. Knowledge arises only when the different representations given up by the senses are put together, but we know that thought process is spontaneous. To form a spontaneous cognition from the diversity of external representations received, they have to be examined, received into the mind and connected. This process Kant calls synthesis. Synthesis is thus the process of joining different representations to each other and of comprehending their diversity in one cognition. Kant says that synthesis is a mere operation of the imagination and is blind, but it is an indispensable operation of the soul, and without it we cannot have any cognition. Pure synthesis, Kant says, give us the details of the pure faculties of understanding. Kant further says that the same function which gives unity to the different representation in a formal judgment also gives unity to the synthesis of different representations that we receive. It is this unity that he calls the pure concepts of understanding. Since a common function underlies pure, that is formal judgments and pure concepts of understanding, Kant concludes that they must have similar structure. Therefore, from the table of judgments, Kant worked backwards and arrived at the a priori faculties of the mind, that is pure concepts of understanding which makes understanding possible. Kant concludes that there must be 12 corresponding faculties of understanding which work behind the 12 types of judgments. Following Aristotle, Kant calls them the categories of understanding that we can see now. Quantity, divisions, unity, plurality, totality. Quality, divisions, reality, negation, limitation. Relation, divisions, inherence and subsistence. Causality and dependence, community. Modality, divisions, possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, necessity, contingency. The analysis of the logical structure of judgments followed by the deduction of the 12 categories of understanding from the structure of these judgments is called the metaphysical deduction of the categories. In the metaphysical deduction, I established the a priori origin of the categories through their perfect fit with the universal logical functions of thinking, that is, with what goes on in the basic kinds of judgment, wrote Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason. Thus, in metaphysical deduction, he deduces the categories from the types of judgments in formal logic. The categories of understanding are a priori. They provide the form of thought almost as how space and time provide the form of sensibility. But what is the justification for these categories? Why should such a priori categories be necessary for experience? Why sensations themselves are not sufficient? How can there be a guarantee that subjective conditions of thought can have objective validity? How to prove that the a priori concepts can apply to objects outside? It is these questions that Kant answers in the transcendental deduction of categories. To this question, Kant answers that if it is only through this representation that anything can be known as an object, any object that the representation has will have to measure up to whatever standards the representation sets, whatever conditions it imposes, and in that way the representation can settle some aspects of what the object will be like. Objects have to conform to our a priori concepts, because if it does not, then nothing is possible as an object of experience. Now, let us see what is Copernican revolution of Kant. Till Copernicus, it was believed that the earth was at the center of the solar system, but Copernicus discovered that it was the sun and not the earth that is at the center. Likewise, Kant claims to have put aside down the model of knowledge by showing that it is the objects that approach the mind to be known, and it is not that the mind approaches the objects to know them. Until now, it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to the objects. Let us now change our tack and experiment with doing metaphysics on the basis of the assumption that the objects must conform to our knowledge. Kant wrote in the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason. He believed that it would conform with the view that a priori knowledge of the objects will tell us something definite about them before they are given to us. For example, if we judge something to be solid, we will have to apply our concepts of solidity to it. The concept of solidity is not received from outside world, but is a priori. The view here is that the objects outside the senses are known only if they conform to the categories of understanding. It is not that the mind approaches the objects and finds out their real nature, but the objects are known only if they conform to the categories of the mind. Instead of the mind approaching the objects, it must be presumed that the objects approach the mind to be known at all. Reason must approach nature not as a pupil, but as a judge. Now, let us go back to the categories and their role. If each representation were completely foreign to every other, as it was standing apart in isolation, there would be no such thing as knowledge, because knowledge is essentially a whole in which representations stand compared and connected. Every sensory state contains a variety of different elements, which leads to say that each such state involves a seeing together. Corresponding to every seeing together, there is a putting together. Thus, passive intake can make knowledge possible only when it is combined with something active. This activeness is exercised in 3 acts of synthesis that must occur in all knowledge. They are: 1. Apprehending representations as states of the mind in intuition, 2. Reproducing them in imagination, and 3. Recognizing them in a concept. Now, let us see what is the synthesis of apprehension in intuition. Whatever be the origin of our representations, whether they come from the influence of outer things or from inner causes, whether they arise a priori or empirically as appearances, they are all states of the mind, and so all belong to inner sense. Every intuition contains in itself a manifold, a variety of different elements. Even a straight line is different points put together. For this manifold to give rise to a unified intuition, it must first be run through and held together. Kant called this act of running through and holding together of different intuitions the synthesis of apprehension in intuition. This synthesis is a priori. Without synthesis of apprehension in intuitions, which we will have only sense data, but no scientific knowledge. Now, let us see what is the synthesis of reproduction in imagination. There has to be something that makes the reproduction of appearances possible by serving as the a priori basis for the necessary synthetic unity of appearances. Else, we will not be able to connect one point in a line with the other. Even our purest a priori intuitions provide us with knowledge only if the manifold in them hangs together and makes synthesis of reproduction possible. This synthesis of reproduction in imagination is also based on a priori principles and precedes experience and scientific knowledge. Now, let us see what is synthesis of recognition in a concept. If one were not conscious that what is being thought now is the same as what was thought a moment ago, the present state of affairs would be a new representation. It will have no connection to the step by step act which generates knowledge. For knowledge to arise, such pieces should be together and understood as a single concept. This is the synthesis of recognition in a concept. It is also an a priori faculty of the mind. These 3 syntheses point to 3 subjective sources of knowledge which make possible the understanding itself and consequently all experience as its empirical product. But what makes these categories possible and necessary is the way our entire sensibility and every possible appearance relate to basic self-awareness. Kant's concept of self-awareness is called synthetic unity of apperception. Now, let us see what is synthetic unity of apperception according to Kant. Apart from empirical awareness or the awareness of external world, we also have self-awareness which is pure and devoid of external senses. This self-awareness is the synthetic unity of apperception. It is presupposed by all our thoughts and intuitions, so it can't result from self-survey. This basic self-awareness is a prior to experience and hence is transcendental. Understanding is the faculty of combining a priori and bringing the manifold of given representations under unity of self-awareness. Kant says that the principle of the synthetic unity of self-awareness is the supreme principle of all use of the understanding. In the absence of that synthetic unity, there would not be any item sharing the act of self-awareness, that is, there would not be items gathered together in a single self-consciousness, in which case nothing would be thought or known. All unifying of representations requires unity of consciousness in the synthesis of them. The principle of the basic synthetic unity of self-awareness is the first pure knowledge that the understanding has and is the basis for all the other uses of the understanding. The synthetic unity of consciousness therefore sets an objective precondition for any knowledge. This is a state of inner sense in which various items are unified in the thought I think, that is, in which they are claimed as mine. The logical form of all judgments consists in the objective unity of the self-awareness of the concepts that the judgments contain. When I have an intuition that involves a manifold, it must conform to the basic synthetic unity of self-awareness, because that is the only way the elements in a manifold can be brought together in a single intuition. Thus, in metaphysical exposition of the categories, Kant shows that a priori categories of understanding exist. In transcendental exposition, he shows how they apply to external objects. Now, a few assignments for you to work out. Number 1, what does Kant mean by saying that both empiricism and rationalism are right in what they affirm, but wrong in what they deny? Number 2, why is it said that Hume woke up Kant from his dogmatic slumber? Number 3, why is Kant's philosophy called transcendental? Number 4, why is Kant regarded as a great philosopher? Now, I will suggest a few reference books for your further studies. Critique of Pure Reason, translation by N.K. Smith. The History of Western Philosophy, Bertrand Russell. History of Philosophy, Frank Tilly. The Story of Philosophy, Will Durant. Thank you for listening to this lecture.